I sympathize, Drew. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and we already had
Oh,
that catastrophic wreck out in Fort Worth. So we're hunkering down here as well in Dallas.
Oh my gosh.
yeah,
I think our low on Monday is supposed to be -1, which is
yeah.
unheard of.
Wow. Yeah. I would have maybe
Boy.
avoid driving. People tend to not know how to drive in conditions like
They
that.
do not. That's why at the first hint of a snowflake, we all show up at the grocery store and buy everything there is,
Exactly.
uh, so we
Yeah.
can settle in for the week.
I grew up in South Dakota and I feel that in my bones. It, every time I've talked to my parents this week, they're like, oh, it's 7 degrees or oh, it's this. And I'm like, you guys know there are warmer places to live, right? It's crazy. But yeah, I think the trick is not traveling in that kind of weather.
Yes.
Yeah, you gotta just hunker down at home and drink your coffee and watch some Netflix, maybe go on a run if you
I was
can.
going to say, put on the micro spikes and go for a run. I've got mine ordered, should be here today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Anybody, let me know if you need a discount for Zwift. Can try to get you a membership.
I do.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind, Jay.
I'm a huge fan of Zwift these days. Man, I don't think I'll throw this out there, and this is recording so people can listen to this later. I don't think buying a treadmill is worth it. I think if you have money and you want to buy something that's going to help with your training, buy a stationary bike. That way you can benefit from cross training. Zoe and I had this discussion yesterday. We were like, if we could buy a treadmill, would we? And we're like, no, because you can just run outside almost any day of the year. When it snows here, a foot of snow, we just run in the tire tracks. If it's a slog, we'll just do a little bit less. We don't really think the treadmill is that worth it, but the bike is worth it because if you run in the morning, you can do a little bit of a light Zwift ride in the afternoon, get your aerobic system going again. It's low impact for the body. Rather, the treadmill is just the same impact forces as running outside. So, maybe I'll get into marketing for Zwift, Kristen, because I think at least for me, using Zwift has been a huge help in my training, and not just Zwift, but the stationary bike, right? Like Zwift is a nice way to apply your time. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting how, and I feel like now when I get on Strava, it's like, oh, there are more people who have been on Zwift than there are that have actually ran, especially like in the winter. So, but yeah, it's a fun team to work for. That's for sure. You could
That's
be
awesome.
one of our athletes, TJ.
Ah,
Hey,
I don't know.
Kristen, is it more beneficial to get a smart trainer or a dumb trainer with Zwift? I use the speed sensor, cadence sensor combo right now.
If you have a speed sensor or a power pod that you can put on your shoe, that's fine. You can have a dumb trainer. Smart trainers are expensive. They're like, $500. If you can find one cheaper than that, for sure get the smart trainer. It's kind of just up to your budget. If like you can still make Zwift work if you have a dumb trainer, and even if you have a Peloton, there's a component now that clips into Peloton, so you can still get on Zwift.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are those foot pods accurate? Because I have a spin bike without a computer. I made a mistake when I got mine, and I want to start using Zwift, but I heard they're really inaccurate and not fun.
They have a tendency to be inaccurate. I think you really have to, there's what's it called? Like when you're getting everything set up, you'll do like a little test. So it'll make sure it's as accurate as possible. But again, with the foot pod, it's not going to be 1,000% accurate. There might be like 1 to 2% error.
All right, that's not bad. Cool.
Yeah, which isn't bad. So, okay. That's all I'm going to say about that. Zwift is awesome.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys, I think you know how I stand. You don't need to spend money on a treadmill. You can run outside. But a trainer can be really helpful. And it's great to have if you are injured. That way, you can get some aerobic work in a low impact environment. So athletes who have a trainer tend to have have at least one extra tool that they can use when they're kind of trying to rehab from an injury, something like that. So it's a nice plan B as well. But cool. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to, we're going to get into some questions, but I really wanted to spend a couple extra minutes talking about comparison before we jump into, some of these training questions that you guys provided. Because as I kind of mentioned on Facebook, and in the call last week, on Monday, that was about competition, collaboration, and comparison. I feel like we were really only scratching the surface of why that conversation is so important, specifically in talking about comparison. And I had a conversation with Drew during the week about comparison, and a couple of things that kind of stuck out to me about the topic is comparing current self to past self, and some of the toxic, it's kind of the toxic headspace that you can end up in when you spend a lot of time comparing your current self to your past self. I think for me specifically, like as athletes get older, I'm 34. And when I started running, I was much younger. I was in my late 20s. And so, if I was to spend a lot of time comparing myself athletically, where I am today versus where I was when I was, starting to get into trail running, some things that might kind of derail my mental game and my mental processes are like, yeah, I'm not as fast as I used to be. My hill strides aren't as fast. My fast strides just aren't as fast. And if I spend a lot of time with those numbers, I might tend to overlook the fact that aerobically I'm a much stronger athlete. I'm also much more efficient. But it's those little hangups, I think, sometimes that really start to add up over time if we give them a lot of power. And then the fact is, like, as athletes, there is always this kind of moment of comparison, whether we're competing or we are looking at past workouts to see kind of where we are today in terms of fitness. And it can be from one training block to another. It can be one season to another. It doesn't have to be looking at a decade of information. But those traps are ripe for us to fall into. And I think I really wanted to spend another minute or two reiterating how important it is to try to set yourself up for success in these things. I'm gonna turn it over to Drew just for a second, but I wanted to reiterate a couple of strategies that I use to help me to not fall into the comparison. Bowie, get down. Sorry. I may have to do a little dog watching during this call. A couple of things that that I do is one, when I work with my coach, I don't list out my splits ever for any workouts. I don't list out my splits for strides or for hills, and I very rarely look on Strava, especially when I have a particularly good workout or a good day, because I don't want to overemphasize the highs. It's much more important to kind of emphasize the middle ground. We don't want to be training on the extreme. So if we give a workout that doesn't feel good, too much power, the process of comparison is going to be really difficult for us mentally in those moments. But also if we give the process of the other extreme, which is a very good workout, too much power, we may end up expecting to perform at that level every single time we're going out and doing our hill strides or our fast strides or a particular workout. And that kind of thinking isn't realistic. You might have an amazing day, but usually where you kind of fall in the middle and then raising that bar a little bit over time is kind of the way that I hope that you guys start to frame those days. Another thing, and I think Drew will kind of expand on this a little bit, but it's continuing. We mentioned this in the last call. Just don't follow other professional athletes. Don't follow your peers on Strava. If you feel like you're consistently looking at their training in a judgmental way, if you're looking at someone's training in a curious way, that's okay. Having kind of that positive framing can be helpful, but if you're looking at it in terms of comparison, you may end up thinking that you're not enough, that you're not an athlete, that you're not a runner, that you're a bad runner. And it's that kind of thinking that tends to compound over time when we allow, at least for me, in my experience, the human mind tends to grab hold of that stuff and then let it kind of continue to cycle through. And then as it cycles through and I say, I'm not good enough, my running's not good enough, all of a sudden I start to embody those feelings. And it gets much worse. So, it's that example that I think of it as an example of making one voice into 1,000 voices. Yeah, Drew, I was hoping that you would share a little bit. And I just want to say particularly for male athletes who I feel like tend to compartmentalize this stuff deep inside and aren't really always willing to admit that we may feel shame or guilt around comparison, and that can be very toxic. I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to expand on some of the things that we chatted about. I thought that your perspective was really important.
Yeah, of course. And just to elaborate, I kind of want to give a little background for people so that they can get to know me a little better. But every single, coach or running mentor that I've had since I began participating in running or competitive running, I mean, it's been like 25 years now. I started when I was pretty young, and I'm 35 now. But everyone's always encouraged me to be a better runner, which is awesome. I guess what any of us would expect from a coach per se, but encouragement for me was always tied or matched with the attitude that if you're not first, you're last, or if you're not beating your competition, then you're not working hard enough, that there's something wrong or defective with me. And so the act of competing is something that I love, and it's something that I continue to seek out. But competition itself with other people is something, well, I guess competition as in other people, I guess I'm trying to say, is something that I was trained to hate. I was taught that other people at the start line of a race are there to beat me. Other people at the start of a race are there to show me that I'm not good enough, and that I had to, do the opposite, almost like defend myself and defend my training by running really well every single time. And that's just a really negative, toxic thing. Can be really demoralizing, can be really negative. And I guess that most people in the microcosm community aren't necessarily trying to win every single race they run. That's a really unrealistic goal. But to a certain extent, all of us are trying to, I guess, be better versions of ourselves, or to enjoy the sport and to be healthier physically and mentally. And I guess when we let outside sources project negative views of competition on us, it's just that it becomes toxic and detrimental to everything you're striving to do. For me, even present day, I still, and it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but I still have a fear of running with other people who I think might be more fit than me. I purposely avoid races where I don't think that I have a chance of winning. It's just so negative. And because of all the negative outside sources that have been pushing me in a toxic way for years now, I feel like I've limited my ability to prove to myself that I'm good enough, and that running is fun and competing is healthy. For a lot of runners, including myself, what can start as I guess, an unintended backhanded compliment or a poor joke. Like, I wish I had $1 for every time I heard someone say, "Oh, you got second place, Drew." I guess that makes you the first loser, right? But something like that can create so much self-doubt. And the doubt doesn't just affect your running, but it affects your personal life with your family or your work and all kinds of stuff. It's just a really unhealthy mindset. I like to reiterate to my athletes and people that I know that your self-worth isn't tied to results. And if you can really focus on that, I really think that you'll have, I guess, a more positive demeanor and outlook on running specifically. And I like to share my brief stories of my struggles to say that I'm not the only one that feels this way. Just because I ran in high school and college, it doesn't mean that I'm like, that's what all just college athletes feel. This is something that everybody has issues with. I feel at some time or another. And that if you ever feel like you start having feelings of like that you're not good enough, or if you catch yourself, I guess, avoiding going to group runs because you're nervous you're going to be like last, or I can't keep up with them, or I don't think I can keep up with them, like that kind of thing. That's just like, you got to get that out of your head. You got to, like, kind of like TJ said, going around and comparing yourself to others, whether professionals or not, is really, really negative. And that if you're able to find people to be around that, I guess, are constant sources of light and encouragement, that's the way to go. That's what I have to do. And so talking to your coach, all the coaches at Microcosm are amazing at doing this, but lifting people up and advising and honestly just listening sometimes and assisting is really, really big deal. And before I turn it back over to TJ, I wanted to say too that Zoe mentioned on Monday's call that if you find yourself at the top of the, what we'll say is like the proverbial podium, and you're by yourself, then you did it wrong. That's something that really stuck out to me as someone who's always been kind of an independent runner / racer. But as you get better, you should be helping other athletes around you get better too. And I encourage everyone on the call to really think about that as well, and to take time to process those 2 points. One, that your, I guess, self-worth isn't tied to results, and that 2, you need to be continually lifting other people up alongside you as well.
Yeah, I love that, Drew, and thanks for kind of sharing some of the more personal parts of your running journey. I think that, you know, it's important to be vulnerable, even as a coach. You know, the 4 of us who are on the call today, we are humans, and we experience all of the same things that you guys do. So please don't put us on pedestals. I'm just going to say that right now. None of us have overcome any of these things. We are always working on them, and perhaps are just a little bit more aware of it because we're maybe a little bit farther along in our running journeys than some of the other athletes here. And that's okay. You know, it's kind of our job to help you guys realize and understand if you're engaging in maybe some unhealthy framing of competition or comparison and things like that. And then when our expertise is limited because we are not therapists, we will point you towards the proper, you know, professionals that can really help you. We have some great people on our team who do this for a living and are complete experts. And we learn a lot from them, but, you know, none of what we say takes the place of working with somebody, especially if you are starting to really feel like you're dealing with some toxic thoughts around comparison, or you're kind of compounding those thoughts and they're getting much worse over time. You know, just to maybe spend a couple more minutes on this, I think, you know, as high achieving athletes and people, I mean, everybody on this team particularly is a really high achiever, and to say that in a positive way. Everybody here, you know, is pushing in their careers. Everybody here is working really hard to become better at running. If that wasn't something that interests you, you wouldn't be a part of this. And so, you know, as you continue to get better, I think it's important to, you know, continue to affirm to yourself that what you're doing is enough, that you have a plan that is designed specifically for you based on all the things that you have going on in your life. And that plan works independently, no matter, you know, what race you're doing or who you're running against. And so at least for me, it helps to just reiterate that, you know, for myself, my plan is for me. This is the way that I'm going to get to, you know, my goal in a successful way, in a healthy way. And I think it's also really important to kind of just note that if you are falling a little bit short of your goals, that's okay. Give it some time. In the meantime, you know, lift people up who, you know, that are around you. Try to be supportive. And if you aren't really finding that you're part of that culture of excellence or that supportive culture around you, know that sometimes the first step to building out that support group, it involves hard choices, like ditching relationships that are toxic or don't serve you, and not going to group runs where people put you down, and then taking some time to seek out other opportunities. We have some amazing runners on this team who constantly have like all of these people that they run with. It blows my mind because I'm kind of like a solo runner. I run with Zoe or like maybe a couple friends, and I can't believe how many people, you know, do have these supportive groups. And if you are part of one of those groups or trying to become part of one of those groups, you know, show up, be a beacon of light for your community. If you see somebody at a group run who's struggling, run with them, run at the back of the pack. That is exactly what I do. That's what Zoe does. When we used to go to group runs here in Carbondale, we run with the slowest runner. It doesn't matter that we do well at races. We're there to be a part of the community, not to kind of embrace some of the more toxic sides of competition and an athletic life. And we all know that these things exist out there. But it's up to us as people who are aware of that to try to not necessarily put a stop to it, but slow it down. I don't think that, you know, we'll ever be able to fully stop some of these things from happening, but we can do our part. And so to me and to Zoe and the rest of our coaches, you know, that really means a lot. That means way more than you guys going out and winning races. It means a lot more than you guys going and competing. You know, the first thing that we think of as an important part of this process is that you guys take what you learn here and you bring it to your communities so you can become an example for them. And I applaud all of you guys who are already doing that, because you will have a positive impact on others by approaching, you know, your group runs and your races with that kind of mindset. It's all about collaboration. The more we kind of continue to grab on to those comparative moments where we're looking at other people, seeing how we stack up, seeing how we measure up, that's when I kind of like to say, like, we end up with a lower vibration, right? Like, we're not our best selves in those moments. We're our best selves when we're supporting others. Well, cool. Yeah, thanks for listening in on that kind of part of the conversation. And I'm sure we're going to readdress these things, you know, over the course of the rest of the year, because I think that, as we mentioned, that, you know, competition, collaboration, and comparison is probably the most fundamental and most important topic for all of you guys and for us as coaches too, as we, you know, are also consistently competing and need to reiterate these kind of ideas for ourselves too. So that way over time they become, you know, natural, in the way that we act becomes habit. Well, great. So we've got some questions, and you're dealing with just me today, so you know it's going to be super fast. Zoe's better at getting to the point. Anyways, I think we're going to start with the question on breathing. Yeah, this is a really important question. Breathing. I've been reading a book called Breath the new science of a lost art, and it discusses the power of nose breathing, especially for endurance sports, fully exhaling, taking fewer breaths per minute, and more. Curious if you have any insights into this kind of thinking, particularly as it relates to distance running. So I am going to tell you guys something. Don't nose breathe. It's not that important. I think people tend to really overemphasize nose breathing. I have a lot of athletes who do that. Breathe through your nose and your mouth at the same time if you can. If not, just breathe through your mouth. It's not important to nose breathe. I think one, it gives you a false sense of what your easy effort is. I've had a lot of athletes say to me, TJ, I'm practicing my nose breathing. It's really helping me get in touch with my easy effort. And I'll say, hey, that's great, but there's no science behind nose breathing. If there was, it would be written about everywhere, especially in one of my favorite books by Jack Daniels, who has an entire chapter about breathing rhythms. And it mentions nothing about nose breathing. And I consider this one of my training Bibles. Plus, actually from my personal experience, I have kind of worked with, and tried nose breathing, but I find that it's very inefficient. And the other kind of thing that is important to mention is that taking fewer breaths is also not a great idea. We all think about taking those long exhalations like we're meditating, and I am really into that. But there's a time and a place for that, like when you're lying down in a dark room, not when you're out running. If you take long breaths, you are, in fact, probably minimizing the amount of oxygen that you can actually take in per minute. And so if you take less oxygen in per minute, you're not going to be fueling your muscles and you're going to fatigue faster. So when you're thinking about breathing, you want to take in the most air you can, period. I doubt that the nose is going to get it done. We're much more efficient breathing through our mouths while we're exercising. And actually, Jack Daniels suggests that the most efficient breathing is when you take 2 steps for every breath. So what that really means is when you stride left, right, that's 1 inhalation. And then you stride left, right, you exhale, and so forth. Now there's other types of breathing rhythms, but in the training lab, it tends to be that kind of 2 to 2, 2 steps for each breath allows you to take in the most oxygen. So it's the most efficient and it's the best for running. You guys are more than welcome to explore this stuff. I think that breathing and breathing easy is a very big indication of your effort. But I don't want you to get too wrapped up into it. If you're taking really long breaths and really long exhalations, you may not be getting enough oxygen. Now, if you're running at a recovery effort, your breathing feels more or less the same as when you're out walking around with some friends. That's totally fine. That's probably great. You're not exerting yourself. But when you're running easy and getting up towards aerobic threshold and things like that and running workouts, it's all about getting the most air in. And if you withhold your breathing, you can start to get side spurs and all these other things that aren't very comfortable. So again, I recommend athletes don't think about nose breathing too much. There's not a lot of science there. 2 to 2 breathing, and I definitely would recommend, if you guys are interested in breathing rhythms, Jack Daniels has an amazing chapter in his book about it, and they go through all the science of how many liters of oxygen you can get in every minute for how many breaths you're taking. Dive into that. There's all sorts of different rhythms. There's 4-4, 2-2, there's 3-3. But it seems that 2-2 is, or 2-1 is the best. Cool. Sweet. We get that one out of the way. What are the benefits of using poles and what are the negatives? I love this question because I think that poles are awesome. We wrote a blog post on this a while back now. It was one of the first blog posts that we ever wrote. And it talks about the benefits of using poles for uphill efforts. First of all, I'll caveat this by saying, don't go to your next race with poles if you haven't trained with them. You need to train with your poles first because aerobically, when you start to use your upper body and you're pulling on the uphill, you will be exerting more energy, and there's a pretty strong neuromuscular stimulus that goes along with that. And so in order to control your breath rate, you need to practice with this stuff first. So I tend to have athletes do a Friday, 2 or 3 Friday uphill boot camps to work on their poles, where they just do some uphill intervals, power hiking at a harder effort. That way, towards that second or third session, in kind of successive weeks, your body starts to really get used to the process of using the poles. And there's kind of a couple different techniques. You can use like one pole and then another pole for each stride going up the hill, or you can use the double pole plant. It really depends on the terrain. The steeper the terrain, the more often athletes are going to use the double pole plant, where they plant higher up on the hill and take 1, 2, or maybe 3 steps for each plant of the pole. Or you can just do, for each stride upwards, you do a pole plant, 1 on each side of the body. Honestly, I think in longer races, huge advantage to using the poles. Keeps your head up, keeps your diaphragm open because you're using the poles for leverage. Rather, when you're power hiking, athletes tend to hunch over. And so towards the end of a race, your airway gets a little bit restricted because of gravity and because you start to fatigue. The poles can really help with that. If you're doing a short race that has climbing, may not be like worth it to bring the poles out because there is, some efficiency loss when you're putting the poles away, when you're taking them out. So those little things normally, in a 50K, unless it's super steep, marathon, you can keep the poles at home. Those harder efforts, you're probably trying to run some more of the climbs anyways, or at least power hike. If the race is long, huge benefits. Again, keeping your diaphragm open, kind of saving the legs a little bit by using the poles. It's super awesome. I've definitely utilized them in some of my longer races with a more uphill element to them. But again, for the shorter stuff, you might want to leave that at home. We have written a blog about this, and it kind of talks a little bit more about the specific efficiencies and whatnot. So I would recommend, guys, if you want some more information on that, check it out. Cool. Yeah, we'll see if we can keep cruising through. It's a little bit easier when you don't have Zoe to also answer the question too, so we don't give 2 answers. Cool. Hold on. But it's harder to look at the chat box. Yeah, question about nose breathing. I find that I can get in as deep of a breath when I breathe through my mouth as through my nose. Any idea why that might be? I would say that that's probably, just physiology. I don't think that it's abnormal to be able to get in a deep breath when breathing through. You can't get as deep of a breath. You know, it's not always about having the most oxygen in one breath. Something that I learned, Kira, from diving into this part in the Jack Daniels book is its frequency of breath that brings in the most oxygen. So when you're running really hard, it does tend that your breath might be more shallow, but the frequency of your breath helps to kind of make up that like loss of oxygen from one long breath to another. I hope that makes sense, and I could try to maybe photocopy this chapter from this book and provide it to you guys in Facebook so you can read about it. It's pretty normal, especially if you're into yoga or meditation, to be able to get in a pretty big breath of air through the nose. I know, you know, for people who are really aware of their breath and practice these things all the time, that probably feels like second nature. You know, for me, when I try this, and I've been working on my breathing for 20 years, so I feel pretty great about it. But it's the exhalation that is the tougher part of so it's getting the air out, which is also a vital part of the process. For me, when I'm focusing too much on nose breathing, I start to breathe slower, and then I'm not getting the air out quick enough. So that will cause some cramping. Again, you know, it's not necessarily how much air you bring in on one breath, or else we'd be holding our breath and doing like 4-to-1 breathing. We really want to breathe in and out, in and out. And it's about getting enough breaths in every single minute in an efficient way. That's kind of where the 2-to-2 rhythm comes in. I hope that made sense to you. Cool. All right. I really like this question. And thanks, you know who you are. Thanks for providing that big list. As a complete beginner, what expectations should I have in the process, short or long term? Benefits mentally and physically, what's realistic? I love this question. First and foremost, I think as a beginner, it's really important to kind of reframe how you look at progress and kind of the timeline for that progress. I really like beginner athletes to look at things from a 1, 2, and 3 year perspective. One, because it takes a lot of time for the musculoskeletal system to adapt to the impact forces of running, right? Running has a lot of impact forces. So when we're pounding the pavement over time, we're creating a little bits of damage at a cellular level to our body. In order to get better at running, you really have to slow that process down. So a little less volume each day. The frequency of the runs is important for consistency and getting more efficient. But we have to really control for those impact forces. At least on the coaching side, I'm helping my athletes control for that by lowering the overall volume, upping the frequency, and making sure that no one day is too acutely stressful, because that acute stress could provoke an injury. So over time, you know, the short-term process goals would be just getting better at recovering between runs. I think that's a huge indication of progress, especially when, you know, an athlete's kind of getting into that 20-mile to 25-mile a week volume range, which is where that consistency like really starts to take hold, and an athlete starting to feel a little bit more efficient. And then, you know, that weekend long run gets a little bit longer, it could be 6 to 8 miles at that point, which is, you know, taking a beginner athlete maybe an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. Being able to recover from that Saturday long run to Sunday and not feel, you know, really sore, or to not feel like just overly fatigued on Sunday from the Saturday long run. That is one of the first kind of process-oriented goals that I look for with my beginners. I think the second one is being able to do some hill work. for a beginner athlete. So, you know, it depends on the athlete, particularly, and whether they're going to be doing a walk run to start, or whether they're going to be, you know, maybe they're in that 10-mile a week and we're trying to get them up to that 20 to 25-mile zone. Being able to work in those hills to start to build speed and efficiency, strength and power. And we want to use the hills because it lowers impact forces, and it's going to be better for your body. And ideally, it's going to help prevent injury while kind of stressing your system. And we're talking, you know, most of you kind of know about this stuff, but for anybody who hasn't done hills yet, we're only talking about, you know, maybe 2 minutes of work or less. You know, for a lot of beginners that I work with, we start with, you know, 15-second or 20-second hills. We don't get into the 30-second hills or the minute-long hills for a lot, you know, farther along in the process. So yeah, that is another big thing. And being able to kind of measure recovery there, smoothness of stride, is something that I kind of look for in verbalized feedback to me. I like the part about this question that kind of talks about the mental side too. So for, you know, a beginner athlete kind of engaging in the process, and we're talking over the first 2 or 3 months, just being able to feel a little bit more comfortable out there is another big process oriented goal that I look for. Being able to kind of to not be run down mentally after the long run. I'm not looking just for physical recovery, but for mental recovery too. And I don't generally start to raise volume too much until I kind of get kind of those like written feedback about these things. I think for me that everything with my athletes starts between the ears, and the physical manifestations of that often come afterwards. So it's really important to look at these from the mental and emotional standpoint too. You know, and long-term goals with all this stuff, yeah, another really good kind of part of this question. But again, you know, I think long-term goals are building efficiency, being able to do some longer workouts, maybe 1 minute long strides and things like that, that kind of start to help you get faster over time. And those things can take quite a bit of time to properly be implemented into a plan. It depends on the athlete, their training history, and all of that. But, you know, in the long term, I would hope to, as a coach, maybe get an athlete to complete an adventure that they're really interested in doing, or to complete a race that they were interested in doing, because having kind of those external goals can really help motivate them in the process. Running doesn't feel very good in your first couple of years for most people. It is just hard. Not every day feels like a ray of sunshine. And that isn't, like, running is hard. There's no other way to put that. So, you know, making sure that, you know, we have moments of celebration along the way are really important, both short and long term, but generally kind of having like 1 or 2 big goals for a year-long training cycle can be helpful. Yeah, I hope that helps. And for any beginners out there, you know, feel free to follow up with your individual coach to kind of see what track you're on. And if you haven't set any goals for yourself, if you're thinking, oh man, like I'm just trying to get out here and enjoy the process, you know, all of that is amazing. But I would encourage you to have like 1 or 2 goals that help to stretch and guide you in the training a little bit, because that kind of feeling of like satisfaction after completing a goal can be really beneficial and provide the impetus for the next thing for you, especially in that first couple years. Awesome. Let me just make sure. Okay, did that one. This is a tough question. Oh man. All right. Why can I run quickly on flat but struggle power hiking steeps? What can I do to improve? This is a really hard question. Bowie, no. Good. This is such a hard question. So we can kind of go back to the kind of neuromuscular side of like steep hiking and steep running. This is all about frequency of very specialized training. If you're a fast runner on the flats, generally you're going to do really well on climbs. But that's up to a certain point. I think a lot of you guys who are out there adventuring kind of know that like grade that things are no longer runnable. Where if you're running, you're floored. Your breath is like out of control. Your heart rate is skyrocketing. At least that's what it feels like for me. And I would say kind of the way to approach that situation is to, one, embrace the power hike in those moments. Whether you're using your poles kind of in the way that I described earlier, or you've got your hands on your knees and you're really driving up the hill. I think embracing the power hike in those moments is crucial. There is nothing wrong with power hiking. And in fact, I think some of our best power hikers on the team and those that I've seen kind of at events and when I've been able to run with different friends and whatnot, they are also really fast on the flats. And that turnover carries over. But because of the neuromuscular aspect of moving uphill, you need to be able to apply that in a few sessions in order to really improve it. So if you're not actively going out and focusing on improving your power hiking, whether it's during your adventure run on a Saturday or maybe on your recovery run on a Thursday, where you're really focusing in on like walking the uphills and keeping your heart rate low. If you're not using those opportunities, it's going to be hard to get better. Because power hiking, the cadence from flat running does help, but again, it's not exactly the same thing. Another thing that I ask athletes to focus on is their foot strike when they're moving uphill. Strike with the heel so you can load the entire chain from the glutes down. You don't want to get stuck in the habit of overusing your calves when you're hiking steeps and when you're power hiking steep terrain. When you do that, you're going to fatigue a lot quicker. You're going to slow a lot down. Start with a heel strike. Load the chain from the glutes down and use the big muscles to help you get up the hill. Another thing that athletes tend to overemphasize is huge steps when they're power hiking. They want to take these giant, almost bounding steps. I would recommend, just like in fast running, you make the steps a little bit smaller, but you make them more frequent. That way you don't tire yourself out as quickly. Those big bounding steps use a lot more energy than the smaller steps. So yeah, I think those are a couple actionable steps that you can take for improving your really steep hiking game. One, go out on your long runs and focus on it. Two, you want to load the whole chain with a heel strike. And then also consider a few more steps rather than big bounding steps. And if you're practicing this stuff over time, you're going to get better at it. The faster running supports this. And just know when you start to feel your uphill running is increasing your perceived effort, your heart rate is climbing, your breath rate is climbing, that's an indication you should hike. And hiking is a vital part of trail running. So don't be afraid to embrace that. When you think about, we could tie this back to comparison for a minute. Every athlete power hikes, from Jim Walmsley to, the best runners in the world. I got to go out and do the 4-pass loop with one of my friends over the summer, and she is one of the best sky runners in the entire world. And she power hikes like a boss. And I would recommend to all of you guys that you embrace power hiking. When you start to feel your effort levels climbing, it's a great indication to power hike. That doesn't make you lesser of a runner. In fact, it makes you a much smarter and more efficient runner over time by helping you save energy so you can run better on the downs and flats and make up time that way. Again, huge proponent of power hiking. I do tons of power hiking, and you guys should too. Cool. All right, I think we've got time for one more. I'm gonna go with the glute activation question, which is, yeah, all of these seem to be in line today. This is great. So glute activation, why is it important? How do we do it? How do we know we are doing it? So yeah, a lot of our overuse injuries are a result of having inactive glutes. This is something that the data kind of suggests via conversation with a lot of athletes who have been dealing with little injuries. And in Zoe, in our collective kind of running careers and the careers of other athletes, stuff with the calves, the hamstrings, the IT bands, usually a result of not using the glutes enough. And the glutes are fundamental, right? They're a big stabilizing muscle. They're a powerhouse muscle, and we've got to use them. So it's important. Why? Because they provide stability, they provide power, especially on the uphill, and even more so on the flats than you guys might realize. And by using your glutes, you can prevent overusing other muscle groups. For athletes who are having some trouble with glute activation, I really recommend doing some workouts with some strength work with kind of the purpose of feeling the glutes activate. So a few that I like and that have been recommended to me by an amazing strength coach here in our valley. One is the single leg deadlift. Fundamental. Like if I'm having any issues with my glute activation, I will use that workout a few times a week, and it tends to get things firing. The other one is just a simple forward lunge, but when you lunge forward, don't just squeeze your lunging glute, but also squeeze your back leg glute too. You want to be able to use both glutes because the glutes are helping to stabilize as well as to kind of like provide the strength element. And another one that is really effective is the step up. And when you're stepping up, make sure you're squeezing both glutes, not just the glute that you're stabilizing with, which is the leg that you're standing on, but squeeze the glute of the glute that you're driving with the knee. A lot of times athletes are having hip issues and things like that because their knee drive isn't that great. And it's a function sometimes of having an inactive glute at the top of the drive. Sorry, just reading the chat here. Yeah, that's a great point, Pete. Sometimes, and I know this for myself, like sometimes I have trouble gauging whether my glutes are activating or not, because sometimes my glutes are just, no. Sorry, because sometimes my glutes are just tight. So make sure you guys are working on your glutes. If your muscles are tight, they're not going to be as active. So I would recommend, yeah, like Pete, like the hypervolt gun, post workout and before workout, doing some just easy, gentle stretching after a run can help. Rolling your glutes out can help. Because sometimes our glutes are tight, so we think they're firing, because you want to kind of feel that squeeze a little bit in the glutes as a good indication of whether we're using them or not. And so if your glutes are tight, they might feel like they're squeezing, but really they're not. Another exercise, if we want to take this to like a really basic level, is to stand up and take a yoga block and put it between your legs, and just slightly bend at the waist, just slightly, not a full athletic stance or anything, and see if you can individually fire each glute when you squeeze that yoga block between your thighs. See if you can fire individually each glute. And then if you can get it to start firing each glute, then take the yoga block away and start with a walk. And walk with a heel strike. And each time you load the heel on your forward step, squeeze your glute, because you're loading the whole chain when you use a heel strike. And then the next step, squeeze your glute, and over and over. And you can start to really feel that glute working. That is like a really good exercise that I started to use last winter from a strength coach that I work with here in the Valley, because I was having some issues with my glutes. And I would totally recommend like use that for a warm up. I did that every day and it helped me a lot. Also, utilize your hill strides as a moment to really acutely feel your glutes working. The purpose for the hill stride is to build a lot of power and strength, and reinforce some of those good running principles that help with economy. But a lot of athletes can start to overuse their quads and hamstrings on hill strides in order to produce higher output levels. Try to slow it down just a little bit and make sure you're really feeling those glutes working. A forward lean on a steep 8% hill grade is going to usually cause your glutes to fire, and you should definitely feel a squeeze when you're running up the hill. Again, if you're not feeling it, start with that progression where you put the yoga block between your legs and try to get your glutes to fire. If you're really doing it well, you'll fire your glutes without your quad flexing. Me, I can't necessarily do that, but I try to work on that. And then again, starting with the walk, and then you can go into the lunge, and then from there you can do the single leg deadlift, where you're getting those things to squeeze. Another tip is when you're doing your monster walks and your band work, always strike with the heel first, so you load the chain. That's going to help your glute fire. When you're doing those band exercises, you should feel your glutes turn on. If you're not feeling the glute working, go back and start with the yoga block between your legs standing and see if you can get each one to fire. I've gone as far, I've explained this to a few athletes, I've gone as far as to literally tell each glute out loud, fire, fire, to try to build that like neuromuscular response, because my glutes have been so inactive in the past. Sometimes just saying it out loud really helps to get those glutes working. Yeah, do that. It can be a really effective warm-up. I like that progression, and I know that it's helped me. And this came from a really well-known strength coach here in our Valley. So I would definitely recommend that you guys consider that. And I'll try to put it in the notes on Facebook, that progression, and see if I can find some pictures or something for you guys so it makes a little bit more sense. Well, cool. Thanks. I hope everybody found this conversation to be helpful, and especially the parts about comparison. At least for me, I feel like that is going to be kind of the foundation of everything, making sure that your mental health in this process is as good as it can be, knowing that we're not striving for perfection in any of these moments, but just progress, trying to get a little bit better each day, and to build that awareness and our kind of perception and our ability to reframe some of these things into a more positive kind of light. I think, at least for me, that helps a lot. All right, guys, thank you. I hope you all have a great weekend of adventuring and work on that glute activation. See ya.